Professor Patrick Bond, Director of the Center for Social Change in the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, joins us now to weigh in on the inclement weather that we have been experiencing in parts of the country. Prof, always a great pleasure having you with us. Good afternoon. So what factors do you think initially led to the prediction of a warm winter in South Africa this year?
Well, the warm winter comes usually from the El Nino, but we are transitioning to La Nina. And so these are effects of bigger cycles. But the basic trend that we're seeing, not only in the 3 incidents of extreme weather this week that you've mentioned, and the 2 tornadoes that hit KZN, the terrible flooding in Quebec, and in 41 informal settlements in Cape Town, those trends are getting worse and worse because of a bigger, broader problem, the climate catastrophe. And I think the main dilemma is that we haven't yet, even after the rain bombs that hit Durban in 2022, where 500 were killed in one day when 350 millimeters dropped, we still haven't seen government, and indeed, with the exception, I think, of Gift of the Givers, all of our emergency response mechanisms, our civil society mutual aid systems, not yet reacting with both emergency relief and with the adaptation of making our cities and our rural areas more climate-proof. Now, don't forget, in the rural areas of South Africa, drought has been a problem. We lost 25% of our maize crop because of those heat waves that hit a few months ago. And then Zimbabwe, 72% loss of their maize. And that's a sort of, let's say, a combination of extremes of terrible droughts and hot weather, and then forest fires and flash fires across our country on the one hand, but on the other, terrible storms that we don't have the stormwater drainage and the pumping systems in place yet.
Prof, I remember you and I had a similar conversation owing to the fact that, we had a pretty warm start to the winter season. But can you explain to us now why we are now experiencing colder temperatures, despite, of course, those earlier predictions?
Well, we are actually going back to normal. What we found in May was extremely warm weather, again, because of the El Nino effect. And so that fades away. It comes in cycles. But it does, I think, since we talked last, it does remind us that having a government that can start calculating damage and making sure that the loss and damage is covered when we have these extreme weather patterns, especially the flooding where ordinary people are their lives are destroyed, their homes absolutely wrecked. Now, what we saw as maybe the best example of a government responding to loss and damage was in 2022, when Toyota asked the city of Durban for 270 million rand of relief. And that was because they lost more than 10,000 cars in the mud that followed that rain bomb in April of 2022. And the dilemma is that, you can go to big business and say, no, stay in Isipingo, keep the big car factory there. But Toyota hasn't joined, let's say, the concern by moving quickly to electric cars. They're still pushing out the diesel and petrol engines there. And the rest of the city of Durban that I've encountered, in groups like the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, complain that the loss and damage payments to ordinary people, or fixing the infrastructure really properly, stronger bridges that can withstand sudden floods through those rivers that come through, or much better housing, that still hasn't happened.
Very interesting, Prof, because I think the last time you were describing to us how the El Nino and La Nina actually contribute to the specific climatic patterns that are currently affecting us in the country. Tornadoes are a rare phenomenon in the country. Can you help us understand, what really actually happens there?
Well, Alicia, what we're seeing are these extreme weather patterns that, yes, sure, we would often find tornadoes. They've hit here in Johannesburg, but now they're getting more intense. And I think that's why, we're calculating much more than ever before these damages as being systematic. They're not just sort of accidents that your insurance company takes care of if you are insured. And that's why, actually, since we talked, the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States has put out quite a path-breaking paper to say, we're really underestimating these damages that come from the extreme weather events. So they've now put out a paper saying it's over $1,050 per ton of carbon. So every time we put out a ton, so we do 500 million tons per year in South Africa, both in our energy sector and all of the industrial areas in our households and our municipal emissions, we are creating, for our $405 billion of GDP, we're creating nearly as much, in fact, even a little bit more, 500 million tons times 1,000. So we're actually creating more damage, $500 billion worth a year, than our GDP. Now, that should really shock us, shouldn't it? Into saying, what is it that is so high carbon? And then the damages that we're going to have to pay for here, especially low-income people who have so few resources. When you see the tragic scenes of their houses being swept away, or more than 24 deaths in the last couple of weeks with all of the terrible weather, then we've got to get serious about calculating loss and damage and making the polluter pay. And that means those who have high emissions. I include myself because I have airplane flights that push my average, my emissions way over the average. I think those are the sorts of things our society should do. And unfortunately, this election season, it didn't really occur, with maybe the exception of a couple of very small parties who raised climate crisis. The others are still, I hate to say, after all of this, they're still climate denialists. They still push from our coal, or perhaps even worse, offshore methane gas. Even the Democratic Alliance is a big promoter of that methane addiction, that we would go from a coal addiction. I think those are the sorts of questions that activists in the Supreme Court last week, when they were fighting Shell and the Impact Oil company of Johnny Copeland, they're raising these questions of the climate as well as their own particular damage from fossil fuels. And I think thinking locally, acting globally is the way we're going to have to be working now.
Prof, I'm glad that you mentioned the aspect of insurance, because in Kariga, speaking to some of our reporters there, they were estimating, of course, this is not the total tally, billions worth of damages, of infrastructural damages. And I suppose insurance, like you mentioned, doesn't necessarily cater to certain specific events, particularly to inclement weather, like we've seen, like you've mentioned, how the tornadoes are actually getting more destructive now. The first time, we saw landslides back in Durban, and a lot of people, like you said, did not have insurance that actually catered for those specific conditions.
You're right. And Alicia, the studies that I've seen about the difference between those who have the insurance, let's say in the global north. Now, I happen to live in the global north here in Johannesburg, in the middle class suburb of Melville. And I have some insurance, but for most of the continent, it's only 4%. Most of the global north is 60% insured. And now, of course, the next problem is the insurance companies they're getting a little bit more climate conscious, and they're saying, no, we're going to withdraw our insurance. If you're living in a low-lying area near the ocean and the sea level is rising, or if you're living near the timber plantations or the forests, or even scrubland that isn't well protected from wildfires, we're not going to insure you anymore. And I think that's where a state insurance could be vital. And it could do, as I say, assess who causes the damage, the polluter pays, and say, you have an environmental debt, you have liabilities, a climate debt that you're going to have to start contributing to. So that insurance, if it's just for profit, the private sector, you won't really get a major structural problem like the climate catastrophe under for-profit sort of business interests. They're going to be retreating from this crisis as fast as they can. And it is time now for a much stronger state. And I wish our electoral system had allowed for much more debate and conversation. We really, I think, have been cheated of thinking about these sorts of real systemic crises.
A very quick one, Prof. Look, how reliable are the current meteorological models in terms of predicting these weather patterns in South Africa? And also, talking to some of the weather experts, they were saying that, when they do give out those inclement weather warnings, communities often just dismiss them or don't heed them.
Yes, and well, in some cases, even if they do, if you're on a shack on a hill in Durban, hundreds of thousands are, well, even if you heed the warning, you still could be swept away. Look, the meteorological experts are recognizing that they don't have all the skills to do very quick, rapid action, rapid warnings. I mean, you think of the coastline of Mozambique and how it gets pounded by cyclones. And so I was talking actually to the Met, the British meteorological experts, who are about as good as any in the world. And they said, no, part of our international aid now has got to be sharing, not intellectual property, copyrighted information, but really making this weather information a public good. That is, taking it off of, the sort of intellectual property. And I think that's what we're going to have to demand from really all our scientists, and in fact, all who produce solar, wind, energy storage, systems of irrigation, that'll work better. Make those public goods. They say that China's overproducing, right? This is the Western line. I don't think that's the case, even if they can't sell all that solar equipment for a profit. Really, the world needs much, much more attention and more, let's say, both mitigation through better energy and transport systems, and then very much more, as we've seen this week, attention to adaptation and getting the stormwater drainage and the pumps and getting irrigation for rural areas. We have to all push for that, don't we?